Welcome back, everybody. Tonight, we're going to be diving into the aftermath of the 2024 U.S. presidential election. We've got so much to cover.
Oh, yeah.
Election results, expert commentary,
Uh-huh.
even some behind-the-scenes glimpses
I love that.
into how these campaigns actually unfolded.
Right.
Get ready for some surprises.
Yeah.
Because this election
This one had some twists.
had a few twists and turns we really need to unpack.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how this election echoes historical patterns in some ways, but then throws in these completely groundbreaking moments in others.
Right.
It
Yeah.
really shows how dynamic American democracy can be.
Okay, so
Yeah,
let's get right to it.
let's do it.
Donald Trump has won the presidency, defeating incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris.
Huge.
That's
Yeah,
It's a big deal,
absolutely.
right? It's not just
It's not just a change of administration.
change of administration. It flips
Right.
the whole political landscape.
The whole thing flipped out.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And what makes this even more remarkable is that Trump is only the second president in U.S. history
What?
to lose a re-election bid and then come back to win a later term.
Wow.
Grover Cleveland was the first, way back in the late 1800s.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It shows you the kind of hold Trump has on a segment of the electorate.
So we all remember how important battleground states were in 2020?
Yeah.
Did they play a big role again this time around?
Definitely. Pennsylvania was crucial for Trump's win. He flipped several counties that had gone for Biden in 2020.
Wow.
What's interesting is that this shift seems to be linked to Trump's improved performance among Hispanic and Latino voters in the state. That's a trend worth keeping an eye on.
I wonder what caused that shift.
Mhm.
Is it about specific policies or maybe a change in how the campaigns reached out to those communities?
That's what political analysts are going to be digging into,
Right.
for sure. Could be a combination of things.
Right.
But to your point about battleground states,
Yeah.
it wasn't just Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona.
Right.
They were all nail-biters. And that vote-counting process
Oh, my God.
kept us all glued to the news.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Huh?
Speaking of nail biters,
Right.
what happened with the Senate?
Yeah.
It felt like that was going to be a really close race, too.
It was, and it ended up with a pretty significant power shift.
Really?
The Republicans gained control of the Senate.
Republicans now.
This means they're likely to confirm more conservative judges and will have a much stronger hand in shaping legislation.
Wow. So what does that mean for things like Supreme Court appointments? I know there's been talk about potential vacancies.
Well, there's the potential for 2 Supreme Court vacancies during Trump's term.
Oh, wow.
With a Republican-controlled Senate, it's very possible the ideological balance of the court could shift even further to the right.
Gosh.
We're talking about potential changes to legal precedents and social policies that could last for generations.
Okay, so big changes in the Senate. What about the House of Representatives?
Uh-huh.
Did we get a clear winner there?
Not quite yet.
Oh.
Control of the House is still undecided.
Okay.
Several races are too close to call, and
Wow.
everyone's watching New York and California closely.
Hmm.
Democrats are fighting to regain seats they lost to Republicans in recent elections.
Interesting.
And if they pull it off, it could be historic.
Historic how? What's at stake there?
If the Democrats win the House,
Okay.
it opens the door for Hakeem Jeffries to become Speaker of the House.
Oh, wow.
He'd be the first Black speaker,
Right.
which would be a truly momentous occasion.
That would be incredible. But even beyond control of the House,
Yeah,
this election already has some remarkable firsts.
it does.
Lisa Blunt, Rochester in Delaware, and Angela Also Brooks in Maryland are the first 2 Black women to serve in the U.S. Senate at the same time.
Right, and Sarah McBride's election to the U.S. House is another landmark. She's the first openly transgender member of Congress.
Yeah, it's amazing.
These victories show how the demographics of the electorate are changing.
Right.
Now, the priorities of American voters are evolving.
And speaking of voters, the AP VoteCast data gives us a peek into what motivated them this time around.
Yeah.
What stood out to you?
One thing that really struck me was that half of all voters, half, said the future of democracy was the most important factor in how they voted.
Oh, wow.
That tells you a lot about the anxieties and concerns many Americans are grappling with right now.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a real crossroads as a country.
Yeah.
Were there any other big issues
Really,
that swayed voters?
cost of living was huge,
Oh.
along with immigration and abortion. Voters sent a clear message that they want these issues addressed.
Yes.
And get this,
Hmm.
the majority of both Harris and Trump voters said they chose their candidate because they supported them,
Right.
not because they disliked the other one.
Oh, interesting.
That shows how much candidate appeal and voter enthusiasm mattered in this election.
So it wasn't just a draw
Just vote against.
vote situation.
Just a vote against.
People were genuinely excited.
Their
Their chosen candidate. It's interesting.
their candidate.
Hey, can we talk about what it was like on election night itself?
Yeah,
I bet the mood was pretty different at each campaign's watch party.
you're absolutely right.
Right.
At Kamala Harris's watch party at Howard University,
Okay.
it was somber as the results came in.
Oh, wow.
Harris even decided not to deliver a concession speech that night,
Oh, really?
which tells you everything you need to know about the disappointment in her camp.
Wow. That's heavy.
Yeah,
I bet it was the opposite over at Trump's gathering.
definitely a different vibe.
Yeah.
At Mar-a-Lago,
Okay.
Trump addressed a crowd that was absolutely ecstatic, celebrating his return to the political stage. It really hammered home just how big this win was for Trump and the Republican Party.
Right.
You could feel the political divide in those contrasting scenes.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
Big win for
Yeah.
Trump, shifts in the Senate and potentially the House,
Right.
historic firsts,
Yeah.
and some insight into what drove voters.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
What are the big takeaways?
I think this election really forces us to ask, what does this result say about where American politics is right now? What happens when you have a Republican Senate, a potentially Democrat-controlled House,
Right.
and a Republican president?
Yeah.
That's a divided government.
That's going to be interesting.
And it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out.
Yeah. Can they find common ground? And what are the big issues facing the new Trump administration?
Yeah,
We get a lot to unpack.
we do.
Yeah.
But before we dive into that, I want to hear from you. What surprised you most about these results? What's sticking with you? It really feels like we're entering uncharted territory, doesn't it?
Let's dig a little deeper into some of the broader trends that emerged during the election. For example, the AP Votecast data revealed some interesting patterns in how different groups voted. Donald Trump had a clear advantage with voters who prioritized immigration and the economy.
That tracks with what we saw from his campaign, right? They really hammered home those issues.
Exactly. On the other hand, Kamala Harris resonated strongly with voters who were most concerned about abortion access, which makes sense given her campaign's focus on reproductive rights.
So both candidates were successful in getting their base fired up. But what about trust? Did that play a big role in this election?
It did, but not always in a predictable way. When it came to taxes, voters were surprisingly split. A similar percentage said they trusted both Trump and Harris to handle that issue. Maybe voters are looking for a new approach to taxes altogether, regardless of party lines. It's definitely a complicated issue with no easy solutions.
You know, one thing that was on my mind this whole election cycle was the accuracy of the vote count. After all the controversy in 2020, it's understandable that some people are worried about the integrity of the process.
Of course. But there's actually some good news on that front. The AP Votecast data shows that roughly 7 out of 10 voters felt confident that votes would be counted accurately across the country. While only 4 out of 10 were very confident, it's still a positive sign that trust in the system hasn't completely eroded.
Okay, that's a relief. A functioning democracy needs people to believe that their votes matter. Beyond the data, though, I'm curious about what things looked like on the ground. Did anything surprising come out of the reporting on the campaigns themselves?
One detail that caught my attention was Trump's focus on courting younger voters, especially first-time voters and young men. He held rallies near college campuses and tailored some of his messages to appeal to that demographic. That's smart, isn't it? Younger voters are the future of the electorate. Do we know if it worked?
It's hard to say for certain, but there were reports of higher turnout among younger voters, especially college-aged men in some areas. So it's possible his strategy had some impact.
Meanwhile, the Harris campaign really went all in on getting their base to turn out, especially in urban areas and among black voters. They also stressed the importance of college student turnout, particularly in those crucial battleground states.
It seems like their efforts paid off to some extent, but maybe not as much as they'd hoped. Turnout was strong in key Democratic areas, but not overwhelming. I wonder if that enthusiasm gap between the candidates might have been a factor in the final outcome.
Yeah, you can have the best policies in the world, but if you can't get people excited to vote for you, it doesn't matter much. Let's talk about voting security for a minute. After all the concerns leading up to the election, did we see any major issues with interference or disruptions?
Thankfully, voting seems to have gone pretty smoothly across the country. There were a few isolated incidents like a poll worker misplacing a key in Arizona or a judge showing up late in Pennsylvania, but nothing that seriously disrupted the process.
So it's just minor hiccups, not widespread problems.
Okay.
Good to hear. But beyond those isolated incidents, did anything change with voting security compared to 2020?
Yes, there were some noticeable changes. Election officials across the country really prioritized both cybersecurity and physical security. They worked hard to ensure the integrity of voting systems and also implemented measures to protect poll workers and voters from potential threats.
It sounds like they learned some valuable lessons from 2020 and took them seriously.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about reacting to the past, there was also a big push to proactively counter misinformation and disinformation campaigns.
Ah, yes. The
Mhm.
never-ending battle against misinformation. It feels like that's become a constant struggle in our digital world.
It has, and this election was no different. False or misleading information was circulating online, often targeting specific communities or demographic groups.
That's so dangerous because it undermines trust in our democratic institutions and makes it harder for people to make informed decisions. But let's circle back to the actual mechanics of the election. Were there any significant changes this year in how ballots were cast and counted?
There were some changes, especially in a few key battleground states. For instance, in Georgia, there was actually a proposal to allow poll workers to hand count ballots, but thankfully a judge blocked it because of concerns about potential chaos and delays.
I can't even imagine. Hand counting millions of ballots would take forever and be so prone to errors.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder of how even seemingly small changes to voting procedures can have a huge impact on the election results.
Weren't there some controversial changes in Arizona, too?
Yes, they implemented a new law requiring that mail-in ballot envelopes be counted first, followed by the ballots themselves. This two-round counting process was criticized by voting rights groups who argued that it would unnecessarily delay the results and create opportunities for challenges.
So adding extra steps to the process just creates more potential for confusion and mistrust. What about Pennsylvania? Any changes there that affected the vote count?
Yes, a couple of court decisions had an impact. One ruling allowed voters whose mail-in ballots were damaged to cast provisional ballots on Election Day.
That seems fair. It ensures that everyone's vote gets counted right.
It does. But at the same time, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court also upheld a decision that could potentially complicate the counting of mail-in ballots. It's a tricky situation because you want to ensure election integrity, but also make sure the process is accessible and efficient.
For sure. And in a tight race like this one, even small changes can have a ripple effect on the outcome. Okay, so we've talked about some of these changes to the voting process, but let's zoom in on some of the key battleground states and see what the data tells us about voter motivations. Let's start with Georgia, which ultimately went for Trump. What were the big issues there?
Remember how we talked about how half of all voters nationwide said the future of democracy was their top concern? Well, in Georgia, it was even higher. Half of all voters in Georgia said the future of democracy was the most important factor in their vote.
Wow, so it wasn't just a national trend, it was really pronounced in Georgia.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about what was on voters' minds?
It tells me they were keenly aware of the stakes in this election and deeply concerned about the direction of the country. They saw this election as being about more than just individual candidates or policy positions. It was about the very foundation of our system of government.
So it wasn't just about Trump versus Harris, it was about something bigger.
Hmm.
But beyond those big picture concerns, what were some of the other key issues that influenced voters in Georgia?
The rising cost of groceries and gas was a huge concern for about 4 out of 10 voters, which reflects those economic anxieties that many Americans are feeling. People want to know that their elected leaders will help them make ends meet.
It's a good reminder that pocketbook issues are always going to be a top priority for voters. Were there any other issues that stood out in Georgia?
Free speech was another big one for about 3 in 10 voters, which shows a growing awareness of the debates around censorship and the role of online platforms. This is an issue that's not going away anytime soon.
It's definitely something we'll be keeping an eye on. And of course, we can't talk about Georgia without mentioning immigration and abortion. Were those hot-button issues there as well?
Absolutely. Both were cited as the most important factor by about a quarter of voters. These issues continue to be incredibly divisive, which reflects those deep cultural and political divides in the U.S.
It's like these issues tap into fundamental values and beliefs that shape how people see the world. Okay, so we've got a sense of the issues that matter to Georgia voters. But what about the candidates themselves? What did voters think about Trump and Harris?
Well, trust was a big factor here, just like we saw nationally. Trump had a clear advantage when it came to which candidate voters trusted more to handle immigration and the economy.
That makes sense, given his experience as president and his campaign's emphasis on those issues. But what about taxes? We saw nationally that voters were pretty split on that one. Was it the same in Georgia?
Yes, very similar. Voters were divided on which candidate they trusted more to handle taxes, with roughly the same number expressing trust in both Trump and Harris.
Maybe voters are just looking for a fresh approach on taxes no matter which party is in power.
Could be. Now, on the issue of abortion, Harris had a clear advantage. Voters overwhelmingly trusted her more than Trump on that issue, which aligns with her longstanding support for reproductive rights.
So it seems like both candidates had their strengths and weaknesses in the eyes of Georgia voters. But beyond trust, what about the overall reasons people gave for voting for one candidate or the other?
This is where things get really interesting. Just like we saw nationally, the majority of both Harris and Trump voters in Georgia said they voted for their candidate, not against the other one. That suggested both candidates were able to energize their base and inspire genuine enthusiasm among their supporters.
That's a really important point because it goes against the idea that this election was just about choosing the lesser of two evils.
Exactly. Both Trump and Harris had a core group of supporters in Georgia who were truly invested in their vision for the future.
It shows you the power of strong leadership and a message that resonates with people. But even with those dedicated supporters, both campaigns had their work cut out for them in Georgia.
For sure. The Trump campaign had to overcome the negative perceptions lingering from his first term. They needed to convince voters that he learned from his mistakes and could lead the country in a more stable and responsible way.
And for the Harris campaign, it was all about energizing a Democratic base that was still recovering from the disappointment of 2020. It's hard to motivate people to vote again after a tough loss.
It is. They had to find a way to rekindle hope and inspire a sense of possibility while also acknowledging the very real challenges facing the country. Both campaigns had to walk a tightrope in Georgia, balancing the need to fire up their base with the need to appeal to undecided voters.
And in such a closely divided electorate, even the smallest shift in voter sentiment can make all the difference.
Absolutely. Every vote counts.
Speaking of close contests, one of the most dramatic moments of election night was when the AP called Pennsylvania for Trump. What made Pennsylvania so crucial in this election?
Pennsylvania was the biggest prize among the battleground states with its 19 electoral votes. Both campaigns poured resources into the state, knowing it could very well decide the election.
And it was a nail-biter, right?
Incredibly close. Both candidates fought for every single vote, and in the end, it was Trump who flipped the state back to the Republican column after Biden won it in 2020.
What do you think contributed to Trump's success in Pennsylvania?
He seemed to connect with voters who felt the current administration wasn't addressing their concerns. He tapped into a sense of frustration and disillusionment that had been building for years.
That's a powerful force in politics, that feeling of being unheard or left behind. But let's not forget the other side of the coin. What does the AP VoteCast data tell us about the motivations of Harris voters in Pennsylvania?
One of the most striking findings was that over 2/3 of Harris voters said the future of democracy was the single most important factor in their vote. That points to a deep concern about the direction of the country, and a sense that the stakes in this election were incredibly high. They saw this as a battle for the soul of America.
It's a powerful reminder that elections are about more than just policies or personalities. They're about the fundamental principles that define us as a nation.
Exactly. And it seems Harris was able to connect with those voters who were anxious about the future of American democracy.
But beyond those existential concerns, what were some of the other key issues that motivated Harris voters in Pennsylvania?
The AP VoteCast data shows that abortion and inflation were both top concerns. These issues were front and center in the campaign, and Harris's stance on them clearly resonated with a segment of Pennsylvania voters.
So while the future of democracy was a big motivator, bread and butter issues like the economy and personal freedoms still played a major role.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that even though those issues were important, they weren't the only factors driving voter decisions. Healthcare, climate change, and education were also cited as important by a significant number of Harris voters.
Right, voters are complex. You can't just assume that everyone who voted for a particular candidate did so for the exact same reasons.
Exactly. Elections are nuanced. They're influenced by a whole mix of factors, from personal values to lived experiences to community ties, and even broader societal trends. It's a reminder that reducing voters to simple stereotypes or assuming they vote based on a single issue is both inaccurate and disrespectful.
That's such an important point. Each voter brings their own unique perspective to the ballot box, and understanding those nuances is key to having a meaningful conversation about politics.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've talked about individual voters, but were there any broader trends that emerged in Pennsylvania during this election? I remember hearing something about a shift in the Hispanic and Latino vote.
Yes, that's right. Trump made significant gains among Hispanic and Latino voters in Pennsylvania, and this trend was mirrored in several other battleground states as well.
Do you think that means the Democratic Party's traditional hold on the Hispanic and Latino vote is weakening?
It's certainly a development worth watching. Political analysts will be dissecting this trend for years to come.
It will be interesting to see how both parties adjust their messaging and outreach efforts to appeal to this growing and increasingly influential demographic.
For sure. And beyond the Hispanic and Latino vote, there were also some notable changes in turnout patterns among different age groups in Pennsylvania.
I heard younger voters turned out in larger numbers than in previous elections, while older voters saw a slight decline in turnout. What do you make of that?
It suggests a growing political engagement among younger generations who are increasingly passionate about issues like climate change, social justice, and economic inequality. This could have major implications for the future of American politics.
As younger generations make up a larger share of the electorate, their values and priorities will inevitably reshape the political landscape. It really is a fascinating time to be following American politics.
Couldn't agree more. The energy and passion of younger voters is something to behold.
So we've talked about Georgia and Pennsylvania. What other states are we looking at in this deep dive? So we talked about Georgia and Pennsylvania, two of the key battleground states
Yeah,
that really shaped the outcome of this election.
absolutely.
But as we zoom out and look at the national picture,
Right.
it's clear that this election wasn't just about individual states.
Yeah.
It was about something
And out something much bigger.
much bigger.
Yeah.
It was about the direction of the country,
Exactly.
about the soul of America,
Yeah.
as you said earlier.
Absolutely. And as the dust settles, I keep coming back to those historic firsts we talked about. Lisa Blunt Rochester and Angela Alsobrooks becoming the first two Black women to serve simultaneously in the U.S. Senate. Sarah McBride being elected as the first openly transgender member of Congress. These victories are incredibly significant. They show that progress is possible, that representation matters, and that change, while often slow and incremental, can be transformative.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
Yeah.
It gives me hope for the future, even amidst all the political turmoil.
Yeah.
But let's be honest,
Yeah.
the country is still deeply divided.
Yeah.
What does this election tell us
Right.
about the state of American politics right now?
One of the starkest takeaways for me is the sheer persistence of political polarization. The two major parties seem further apart than ever on a whole range of issues.
Yeah.
And that divide shows no signs of shrinking.
It's disheartening, isn't it?
It is.
It makes it so much harder to find common ground
Uh-huh.
and actually address the challenges facing the country. We're so focused on fighting each other
Yeah.
that we forget we're all on the same team.
That's exactly it. And this election also highlighted the ongoing struggle to balance the ideals of unity and diversity in American society. We're a nation built on the idea of e pluribus unum, out of many, one. But achieving that unity amidst such a diverse population with such a wide spectrum of beliefs and experiences is a constant challenge.
It's that classic American paradox, right? The
Yeah.
tension between individualism and collectivism, between celebrating our differences and finding common ground. This election really brought that tension to the forefront.
It did, and it underscored the importance of truly listening to and trying to understand perspectives that are different from our own. It's about empathy, about open-mindedness, about recognizing that we all have something to learn from each other. Without those qualities, it's hard to see how we move forward as a nation.
It's a good reminder that a healthy democracy requires more than just voting every few years.
Uh-huh.
It requires active citizenship,
Right.
respectful dialogue, and a willingness to engage with those who hold different views.
I couldn't agree more. Democracy is a verb, not a noun.
Right.
It's something we have to actively participate in, not something that just happens to us.
Okay, so big picture, we're facing some serious challenges.
Hmm.
But let's get specific. What are some of the immediate hurdles the incoming Trump administration will have to deal with?
Well, the economy is right at the top of the list.
Okay,
Inflation is still a major concern,
right.
and many Americans are struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living. Trump will need to address those economic anxieties and find a way to restore confidence in the financial system.
It's interesting because even though the economy is often seen as a traditional issue,
Yeah.
It ties back to those deeper anxieties about the future of democracy.
Right.
When people feel like they're falling behind,
Yeah,
it's easy to lose faith in the system,
that's a great point.
right?
Economic stability is often a prerequisite for political stability.
And of course, we can't forget about climate change. It's not going away, and it's a threat that requires bold action.
For sure.
Trump has been skeptical about the severity of climate change in the past, so it'll be interesting to see how he approaches this issue during his second term.
It's a global challenge
Yes.
that demands global cooperation.
Good.
The decisions the U.S. makes on climate change will have ripple effects around the world.
It's not just about America first anymore.
Right.
It's about the future of the planet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And beyond domestic and global challenges, there's also the question of how Trump will navigate the complex and often volatile international landscape.
Right.
His America First approach often strained relationships with traditional allies.
Right.
So it'll be fascinating to see how he re-engages with the world stage.
It's a reminder that the U.S. president isn't just the leader of a nation. They're the leader of a global superpower with a responsibility to engage constructively with the rest of the world.
That's a heavy burden to bear.
It is. But ultimately, it's a burden that we all share in a way.
Right.
The decisions our leaders make impact all of us, and
Yeah.
we have a responsibility to hold them accountable
Uh-huh.
and engage in the process as informed citizens.
I couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this deep dive
Yeah.
into the 2024 election results,
Right.
I want to turn it back over to you, our listener.
Yes.
What are your biggest takeaways from this election? What questions are still swirling in your mind? What are you hoping to see from the new administration?
This election was a complex and multifaceted event with far-reaching implications.
It really was.
It raised profound questions about the state of American democracy,
Yeah.
the persistence of political polarization,
Uh-huh.
and the challenges of governing a diverse and dynamic nation.
But amidst all the analysis and commentary, it's important to remember that the power ultimately rests with the people. It's up to each of us to engage in thoughtful dialogue, hold our elected leaders accountable, and work towards a future where all Americans feel heard, respected, and represented.
So as you reflect on this election, we encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
Yes.
The future of American democracy depends on the active participation of all its citizens.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been great.
We'll be back soon with more insightful